There were approximately 8 minutes left before the collision. Two Boeing 747s were at the same small airport on Tenerife. One was already moving along the runway. The other would soon turn around at the far end and prepare for takeoff. Between them was thick fog. The control tower could not see both aircraft. The crews could not see each other. And most dangerously, everyone was confident that they roughly understood where the others were. A few minutes later, that confidence would kill 583 people. And this was not a story about an engine failure, an explosion in the air, or a broken wing. Both aircraft were functioning normally. The disaster was created by a chain of ordinary decisions, misunderstandings, and assumptions, each of which on its own might still have been survivable. But on March 27, 1977, they converged on one runway at exactly the same moment. To understand the final 8 minutes, you first have to understand why two giant 747s were at Los Rodeos at all. Their destination was another island, Gran Canaria, but a bomb exploded in the passenger terminal there. Because of the threat of a second explosion, the airport was closed and aircraft began diverting to Tenerife. Los Rodeos was a much smaller airport and quickly became overcrowded. Aircraft were parked so tightly that normal use of the parallel taxiway became impossible. So the runway itself had to be used for taxiing. That already sounds like a bad idea. But as long as everyone can see each other and follows the controller's instructions precisely, such a system can still work. The problem was that the weather decided to add its own item to the list. At about 1658, KLM 4805 is instructed to taxi along the runway to the far end, make a 180-degree turn, and prepare for departure. Behind it is Pan Am 1736. It too will have to enter the same runway, taxi forward, and then turn left onto the third taxiway. Approximately 7.5 minutes remain before the collision. KLM is already moving along the runway. Pan Am is still waiting. In the control tower, everything still appears manageable. But low clouds begin drifting across the airport. Visibility changes within minutes. Soon the controllers can no longer see the aircraft on the runway. Now they are forced to build a picture of the situation almost entirely from radio communications. And this is where the first dangerous detail appears. Language. The KLM crew is Dutch, the Pan Am crew is American, and the controllers are Spanish. Everyone is speaking English, but with different accents, different rhythms, and not always with exactly the same phraseology. For now, it is only an inconvenience. In a few minutes, it will become critical. At about 17:02, Pan Am receives confirmation. Enter the runway and leave it at the third exit on the left. Doubt appears in the cockpit immediately. The third? The first? The crew asks again. The controller repeats, the third. 1, 2, 3. On the airport diagram, it looks simple. In real fog, it is much worse. The first exit requires a sharp 90-degree turn. The next ones branch off at different angles. Pan Am moves slowly forward, counting intersections, while KLM is already approaching the far end of the runway. Approximately 4 minutes remain before the collision. KLM is instructed to make a full turn at the end of the runway and report when ready for ATC clearance. This is an important detail. In RA an air traffic control route clearance and a takeoff clearance are not the same thing. KLM turns around and is now facing in the direction of Pan Am. Between the two 747s are fog and several kilometers of runway. Pan Am continues looking for the third exit. Inside the cockpit they count. 1, 2, is this it? No. The next one. The aircraft moves cautiously because visibility is poor and the runway centerline lights are not working. This is the moment when the disaster still does not look inevitable. Pan Am simply needs to leave the runway. KLM simply needs to wait for a clear takeoff clearance. The controller simply needs confirmation that the runway is clear. 3 simple conditions. None of them will be met. Less than 2 minutes remain before the collision. There is a sense of urgency in the KLM cockpit. The crew has already been traveling for many hours. The closure of Gran Canaria has consumed time. The captain is also concerned about crew duty time limits. If the departure is delayed too long, the flight may have to be canceled. On top of that is the weather. The fog is getting thicker, and there is a risk that visibility will fall below the allowable minimum for takeoff. Psychologically, everything is pushing in the same direction. They need to leave now, but the runway is still not clear. At 17:05:41, the KLM first officer reminds the captain that they still do not have ATC clearance. The captain replies that he knows and tells him to request it. The controller gives KLM its route clearance for after departure: climb, turn, heading. This is not permission to begin the takeoff roll. The first officer reads back the instructions and, at the end, adds a phrase that will become one of the most famous in the history of aviation safety. It could be understood approximately as, "They are now at takeoff." For the KLM crew, this means that takeoff is beginning. For the controller, it means that the aircraft is at the takeoff position and waiting. It is a difference of only a few words, and 583 lives. At 17:06:11, KLM releases the brakes. 36 seconds remain before the collision. The four engines of the Boeing 747 begin building thrust. The enormous aircraft accelerates along a runway that its crew believes is clear. The controller, meanwhile, replies to KLM that they need to wait for takeoff clearance. Almost at the same time, Pan Am transmits that they are still moving along the runway. The two radio transmissions overlap inside the KLM cockpit. Instead of a clear message, there is a sharp burst of noise. Critical information arrives at exactly the moment when the radio channel effectively blocks itself, but then another message comes through clearly enough to be heard. The controller asks Pan Am to report when the runway has been cleared. Pan Am replies that they will report when they are clear. The KLM flight engineer hears this. Approximately 15 seconds remain before the collision. He asks the captain, "Has Pan Am not cleared the runway yet?" The captain does not understand and asks him to repeat it. The flight engineer asks the question again, and this is where the story of Tenerife compresses into one terrifying moment. The aircraft is already accelerating. There is doubt. There is information suggesting that another 747 may still be ahead. The takeoff can still be rejected. The captain answers confidently, "Yes, it is already cleared. There are no more objections." Approximately 13 seconds later, they will collide. Pan Am is still on the runway. Its crew sees the lights of KLM only about 9.5 seconds before impact. At first, it is only light in the fog. Then it becomes clear that the light is moving directly toward them. The Pan Am crew applies power and tries to turn off the runway, but a Boeing 747 is not a car that can simply jerk the wheel and jump onto the shoulder. It is hundreds of tons of metal, fuel, and people moving slowly while another 747 has already accelerated to takeoff speed. The KLM captain sees Pan Am too. Now both crews understand everything. But physics is no longer interested in their decisions. KLM tries to lift off early. The nose rises. The tail of the aircraft strikes the runway. For a moment, it looks as if the 747 might clear the obstacle. It cannot. At 17:06:47, KLM strikes the upper section of Pan Am. The impact destroys both aircraft. KLM comes down farther along the runway and catches fire. No one on board survives, 248 people. A fire begins on Pan Am, but part of the fuselage remains accessible for evacuation. Some people escape through openings in the aircraft while others jump to the ground. Of the 396 people on board Pan Am, 61 survive. The total number of deaths is 583. The deadliest accident in the history of civil aviation did not happen in the sky. It happened on the ground. And that is what makes Tenerife so disturbing. There is no single extraordinary technical defect that could simply be replaced with a new part. There is no unbelievable force of nature that no one could have anticipated. There was an overcrowded apron. There was a blocked taxiway. There was fog. There was a difficult exit. There was an ambiguous phrase. There were overlapping radio transmissions. There was urgency. There was an assumption that the other aircraft had already left the runway, and there was a moment when a crew member asked the right question but did not insist on it again. The investigation concluded that the fundamental cause was KLM beginning takeoff without proper clearance. But Tenerife has remained a lasting example of how disasters rarely begin with one single step. More often, they are chains in which every new mistake makes the previous one more dangerous. After the tragedy, aviation placed even greater emphasis on standardized radio phraseology. The distinction between route clearance and actual takeoff clearance became especially important. Crew training also increasingly emphasized that the authority of a captain cannot be stronger than a safety concern. If someone in the cockpit sees a problem, they must speak clearly, insistently, and in a way that ensures they are heard. So the final 8 minutes of Tenerife are not simply a story about two aircraft in fog. They are a story about how dangerous confidence can become when no one actually sees the full picture. In the control tower, they thought KLM was waiting. In KLM, they thought Pan Am had already left the runway. In Pan Am, they thought they still had time to find the correct exit. And only in the final seconds did all three versions of reality collapse into one, on one runway, in thick fog. When there was no time left to fix anything,